One of the things that people were concerned about last week were the job security of Kevin Stefanski, and with it being a national TV game against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and we know that when you lose on national TV to the Pittsburgh Steelers, things tend to change. I think that's what drove a lot of the concern about job security coming into this game. But now that the Browns have won that game, and have avoided being embarrassed, actually having one of the best moments of the season. The calculus on Kevin Stefanski's job security has changed, and it makes you wonder, like, how legitimate were these conversations even in the first place to even have? How close did Kevin ever come to losing his job? Because the Browns' record is of a record that would get even an established head coach fired. Right? Like, that is just the truth. You go under 300, job security is at risk. It doesn't mean that a team should make that move, but it's just what teams tend to do, right? You look at Andy Reid when he got fired in Philadelphia, didn't end up being the right move, but he got fired because he went under 300. It's just how it goes in the NFL. But the fact that there was a lot of people saying before that Steelers game, specifically right before it, that Kev's job is safe is interesting. And this is in one interaction. Shout out to Cole. He brought this up to me from 92.3 The Fan that I find particularly interesting because it highlights just how much of the fire Kevin talk really didn't have that much substance behind it when it comes to actual reasons other than it's the norm to fire Kevin. And I think this conversation kind of nails it.
Many teams with losing records that have good culture. I mean, I don't know. Like, did it not seem like the Browns' culture was fantastic last year when even with the injuries to Chubb and Deshaun Watson, they still won all those games with Flacco and made the playoffs? I mean, that seemed like a really good and impressive culture to me a year ago. So did Stefanski this offseason, did he forget to take his culture pills?
No, I think
he forgot to take his culture pills, and now he doesn't. Like, I've done 2 Browns games this year. I think they do have a good culture. What about them says bad culture?
The miscommunications, throwing people under the bus. I would say some of the stuff that's starting to happen on social media.
Okay, so that right there kind of tells me just how little substance a lot of these arguments had to fire Kevin, right? Because my whole point when I was talking about, hey, Kevin could get fired was the win-loss record, right? The win-loss record will get you fired in the NFL, and people will justify it on the back end if it's bad enough or if you lose in an embarrassing enough fashion, right? That's what usually gets people fired. I know a lot of people made the point, well, that's very emotional. Yes, but football is a very emotional game. This is all emotion at the end of the day, and teams tend to make emotional decisions, especially the Browns, but most NFL teams make decisions based off of how they feel at the time. And how people were feeling at the time was that Kevin wasn't doing a good enough job just because of the win-loss record. But if we start to try to like pick it apart, right, and look at what Kevin doesn't do well, the culture not being good was one of the main critiques that I had here. And this is why I think it's important when somebody says something that you ask follow-up questions because it became very obvious in this interview. And shout out to, I think this is Nick Wilson. So, I'm not trying to be mean to Nick Wilson or send people to Nick Wilson's page to talk shit about him. Like, I'm just using this as an example. But this is why it's good to ask follow-up questions, because it's easy to say Kevin Stefanski has bad culture, right? But then when you ask somebody to explain why they think the team has bad culture, that's when a statement like that falls apart. Because if you're making the argument the Browns have a bad culture, why is it that you think that way? players are throwing each other under the bus. Well, when is that happening? I haven't seen that happening, right? Like he says that there, I didn't see that happening. So it doesn't seem like that is a legitimate thing, right? Maybe you can count to the fourth quarter of the Saints game, but now you can counter that with what happened on Thursday night. And you can even counter that with the Baltimore game after that week 7 disaster that the Cleveland Browns had to say that, hey, no, they're still playing for them, right? It seems like veteran leadership is still thoroughly behind Kevin Stefanski when it comes to Myles Garrett and Joe Bitonio and Nick Chubb and all the kind of locker room leaders of the team. So where is the culture problem with the Cleveland Browns? Honestly, I've lived through enough Cleveland Brown seasons to know when the culture was crap, right? Like, remember Come Get Me in 2019? Like, yeah, that's when we knew Freddie Kitchens needed to be fired, when you had guys on your team reportedly going up to people saying, hey, man, come grab me. Please trade for me. I need to be out of here. Now, have the Browns have some players who were traded from a non-competitive team to a competitive team and very happy to be there? Yeah, but that makes sense, right? If you go from a 2-8 team and you get traded to a team that's 8-2, you're going to be excited, right? I don't blame Zadarius Smith for being excited. I don't blame Amari Cooper for being excited. I know a lot of people were upset at them for being happy, for being in a better situation for this season. But that makes sense. I mean, the Browns record was what it was. You get traded to a team with a good record. All of a sudden, your outlook on the season is. Imagine if we could trade records, right? And the Browns traded their 2-8 record for an 8-2 record. We'd be excited, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to those players. So it makes sense that those players are excited. So again, like if we're gonna cite the culture being an issue for Kevin Stefanski, I think we have a lot more evidence that Kevin has built a good enough culture here, especially with the win on Thursday, right? Because part of having a good culture is having a floor from a win-loss standpoint. And it looks like the Browns will be able to get to a floor here that's not great, but reasonable, right? Like you're hoping above 500, which would be about 5 wins if the Browns can win 2 more games down the stretch. But given what you dealt with Deshaun at the beginning of the season, I think we would all take, if Jameis got like 1 more win, you went 300 with Jameis at the very least, I think we would all take that as a good enough win there. But this tells me a lot about where the Browns are and what the Browns' actual problems are. I did a video on it where I was talking about the Browns' offensive issues at the beginning of the season versus this season. It's just completely different, right? Like, the problem seems to be that Deshaun Watson played historically bad at quarterback to start the year. And because he's Deshaun Watson, and because he's paid $230 million, and because he has all that guaranteed money, it seems like the front office or ownership made a collective decision. And this is just my speculation. It seems like the front office and ownership made a collective decision to say, hey, this does not look like it's going good with Deshaun. Let's play this thing out and make sure we're 100% before we pull the plug on this Deshaun Watson thing, right? Because if we pull it on him, we want to be sure, because it's going to be expensive. And that's why Deshaun stayed in as long as he did. And because that's the case, this win-loss record isn't really being held against Kevin in the way that it would normally be held against Kevin. And as long as everything else is fine and the culture seems fine with Kevin, Ross Tucker seems to stand behind it. He's a former player, right? Like, then what are you really firing Kevin for at that point?
What's the miscommunication? What's the throwing
miscommunication on defense that continue to happen? And then everybody goes, yeah, hey, we miscommunicated. We'll do better next week.
How is that bad culture? Like, serious question. How is that bad culture? If there's a miscommunication on defense and the response isn't, well, Juan Thornhill messed up, he was supposed to. If the response is, hey, we're going to work together to fix it, how's that bad culture? Like, what part of that response is toxic? Like, if you want to say it keeps happening, okay, yeah, like that's a problem, but that might be a problem with the personnel, right? Maybe you don't have people in here who can run what you want to run, or maybe it's a problem like with what you're trying to run. It might be too complicated, but the response and like miscommunication happening. I mean, the best teams in the NFL have miscommunication in their secondary all the time. Pittsburgh had miscommunication in secondary. Should they fire Mike Tomlin? Because Mike Tomlin's response to that miscommunication is, we're going to work on it. We're going to move on for next week. I mean, should they fire Mike Tomlin? Like, what is that? Well, how's that an example of bad culture? I don't get how he got there.
And you think that's culture as opposed to?
I would say, like, when you're failing to do like rudimentary football things, like for instance, early in the season, it was like a bunch of pretty ridiculous penalties that were happening constantly. Like, I think when it's ticky-tack penalties from professional football players, when there's a bare minimum of standard not being met, I would imagine that's a sign of culture.
Another issue that I have with like the point that he's making is, all of what he said is just so vague at the end of the day that it could mean anything, but nothing at the same time, right? When you can't do rudimentary football issues. Well, what specifically are you talking about? The false starts? Are you talking about the miscommunication on defense? What miscommunication are you referring to? Like, why, when the criticism is not specific, it makes me feel like you're justifying how you feel by making it seem like you have facts on your side, instead of using those facts to kind of tell the story of why it is that you feel the way that you feel, right? Like, that's my main issue with an argument like this, is that it's just so much is based on descriptive words instead of examples of things that actually highlight the problem that he's talking about. It makes me feel like the problem he's talking about is likely being exaggerated.
All right, I say fire everybody. Fire everybody, and go back to being the Browns that every couple of years just bring in new GM, new head coach. Go back to the cycle of failure, when you actually have guys, the only guys that have actually proven that they can do it with this iteration of the Browns. Because I saw with my own two eyes the Browns win the playoff game in Pittsburgh against the Steelers. I saw the Browns make the playoffs last year with the backup quarterback. So, yeah, I mean, good luck. Good luck. Go for it. Get rid of Coach of the Year, two-time Coach of the Year, proven commodity, and go get someone else.
That's another point, right? Like, Kevin's not chopped liver at head coach, as much as some people like to pretend. And if you wanted to get rid of Kevin, who are you going to replace him with? Like, there's a very short list of guys who are qualified enough to take the job, and it would feel like a lateral move with Kevin. And that's ultimately probably why Kevin is going to keep his job, right? Like, he's accomplished enough. And the one thing I've always said is that when it comes to Kevin and moving on from him, we have to understand that this is probably, well, not probably, the most successful coach the Browns have had since the 80s, right? Like, that means something. That matters. So, like, moving on from him has to be a bit more of an argument than what we're used to in years past. And I think that's what Ross Tucker is trying to get through here. And it's in a point that I agree with. Now, do I think that should make Kevin immune to getting fired ever? No. But I do think it means that you have to put together a more significant argument than this to justify Kevin losing his job. But that's my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.